The story you're about to hear does not begin in a sterile laboratory or a quiet archive, but amidst the noise and bustle of a New York street sale. There, among forgotten things and the fragments of other people's lives, an acquaintance of mine made a purchase that seemed to him nothing more than an amusing souvenir. He bought an old fire helmet, an item with a history, a witness to a bygone era. But its true value was hidden not on its scratched surface, but within. As padding to make the helmet fit better, someone long ago had tucked in an old battered notebook. When this notebook came into my hands, I knew at once that I was holding something special. Its covers, once hard, were now thin and brittle with age, and its edges were touched by fire. It gave off a heavy, thick smell of mold and oblivion, the scent of attics and long-locked chests. The yellowed, fragile pages were covered in lines written in an old, faded ink. In some places, the ink had faded so much that the letters had become faint ghosts on the paper, and I had to strain my eyes to make out their shapes. In other places, the text was irretrievably damaged by water. Large sections had turned into blurry ink stains, forever burying the words, and perhaps entire ideas, beneath them. Fire had once touched its pages, leaving a dark, charred border along the edges, causing some words to disappear forever. A long and painstaking process of translation and restoration began. This was not just a translation, but a true restoration of thought, an attempt to piece together the shattered mosaic of a brilliant mind. Every surviving word was worth its weight in gold, every restored phrase a small victory. Due to the lost fragments, many small but possibly key details remained a mystery. And yet the deeper I delved into this text, the more clearly I understood that this manuscript was not just the notes of an unknown engineer. The style of thought, the scale and audacity of the ideas all pointed to one man. Soon my suspicions were confirmed. This notebook was a lost diary, the authentic manuscript of the great inventor who was ahead of his time, Nikola Tesla. And the very first line that I managed to decipher with complete certainty was like a thunderclap from a clear sky. It was not a formula, nor a diagram. It was a direct, respectful, but firm address to another titan of science whose name had become synonymous with genius in the 20th century. Tesla wrote, "You are mistaken, Mr. Einstein. The ether exists."
This single sentence, thrown across the decades, was the beginning of an intellectual duel of titans. While the scientific world was increasingly leaning towards Einstein's revolutionary ideas, towards his new picture of the universe where space and time are flexible, and the good old ether was cast out as an unnecessary relic, Tesla, from the depths of his laboratory, declared, "You have all taken a wrong turn." His diary reveals that for him, the ether was not just a hypothesis. It was the foundation upon which his entire worldview rested, the basis of all his inventions and successes. He believed that, by abandoning the ether, science had deprived itself of the key to understanding the most fundamental forces of nature. But then how could one explain the failure of the famous Michelson-Morley experiment? After all, it seemed to have definitively proven that there was no ether wind that a moving Earth should experience. Tesla had a disarmingly simple and brilliant answer. In his notes, he suggests we imagine a simple analogy. Imagine you were in a boat caught in a huge, powerful whirlpool. You are sitting in this boat and trying to use instruments to measure the movement of the water relative to you. What will be the result? Zero. You will not detect any movement because your boat is moving at the same speed and along the same path as the water in the whirlpool. You are part of the system. And now, writes Tesla, replace the boat in your imagination with the Earth, and the whirlpool with the gigantic etheric vortex in which our planet rushes around the sun. In his view, we cannot detect the ether wind for the same reason. We are not flying through a stationary ether. We are rushing along with it. In his vision, the ether is not emptiness, but an incredibly dense substance thousands of times denser than air. It is this colossal density that explains why light and radio waves propagate at such a gigantic speed. The denser the medium, the faster a wave moves through it. But why don't we feel it? Because, as Tesla believed, the ether is electrically neutral and therefore hardly interacts with our material world. Moreover, he turned the conventional view upside down. It is not that the ether is intangible, it is our world that is practically intangible to it, negligibly sparse. The only manifestation of its presence that we constantly feel is gravity. Tesla proposed an astonishing cosmological theory. All matter, from planets and stars to the smallest particles, once arose from the ether itself, when for unknown reasons a part of it became less dense. He compared this to the formation of air bubbles in water. And now, the surrounding super-dense ether constantly presses on these bubbles of matter, trying to return them to their original state. We call this all-pervading pressure the force of gravity. And only the internal electric charge of matter prevents it from being crushed and turning back into ether.
It was here that Tesla dealt his strongest blow to the theory of relativity. Einstein stated that the speed of light in a vacuum is constant and does not depend on the speed of the source. And that is absolutely correct, Tesla agreed. But in his opinion, this rule can only exist under one condition: if light propagates in some physical medium whose properties limit its speed, just as the air limits the speed of sound. If there were no ether, the speed of light would directly depend on how fast its source was moving. Thus, Einstein himself, while trying to disprove the ether with his main postulate, was in fact proving its existence. It was a grand picture of the world, logical and complete. But a theory, even the most beautiful one, remains just a theory without practical confirmation. The world saw Tesla as a practitioner, an engineer, a magician of electricity, and he understood that he had to go further. But how to prove the existence of the ether, and more importantly, how to control it, how to learn to interact with this invisible, all-pervading force? The answer, as is often the case with geniuses, came to him from the most unexpected source, from a simple and mundane observation. The theoretical structure was built, it was majestic and logical, but it lacked a practical door through which one could enter. Tesla, being first and foremost an experimenter, looked for this door everywhere and found it not in complex calculations, but in the fleeting sight of everyday life. In his diary, he describes how he once watched a sailor leisurely smoking his pipe. The sailor released the smoke from his mouth not as a formless cloud, but in neat, dense rings. These rings of tobacco smoke, before slowly dissolving in the air, traveled a considerable distance, stubbornly maintaining their shape and integrity. In this simple phenomenon, Tesla's brilliant mind saw something more than just an amusement. He saw a model, a stable, self-contained form transferring substance through a medium, the air. This observation ignited a spark in his mind that demanded immediate verification. He decided to transfer this principle from the air to a water environment to study it more clearly. In his laboratory, he took an ordinary metal can. On one side, he carefully cut a small round hole, and on the other, open side, he stretched a piece of thin, elastic leather, creating something like a drum. After filling this simple device with a small amount of dark ink, he lowered it into a large tank of clean, still water. And then, with a sharp flick of his finger, he struck the leather membrane.
The effect was astonishing. A dense ring of ink shot out from the hole in the can and, rotating on its axis, sped through the water. It did not blur or mix with the surrounding environment. Like an invisible projectile, it crossed the entire tank, maintaining its perfect shape. The water in the tank remained almost completely still. All the energy was concentrated inside this vortex. Upon reaching the opposite wall of the tank, the ring struck it and broke apart, causing a powerful and noticeable disturbance in the water at the point of impact. "This is energy transfer," Tesla wrote in his diary. At that moment, he experienced what can only be called an epiphany. He understood everything. Smoke in the air, ink in water. This meant the same principle must work in the ether. He had found what he was looking for, the key to controlling the boundless energy of the universe. He realized that he could create a generator that would emit not smoke or ink, but stable, focused vortex objects made of the ether itself. These etheric vortex rings could travel enormous distances, carrying a colossal energy charge, and they would need no wires to do so. This was not just a new technology, it was a passport to a new world. A world of free, clean energy, available at any point on the planet. Based on this research, he built his generator. "It was a victory," he writes. At that moment, it seemed to him that nothing was impossible. Overcome with euphoria from his discovery, he promised much to the world, to investors, to all of humanity. He was convinced that he was on the threshold of a new era. But the triumph was premature. In his notes, he admits with bitterness, "I did not fully investigate this phenomenon, and for that, I paid a terrible price." The very first full-scale experiments showed that it was not so simple. The etheric vortices behaved unpredictably. They lost energy upon contact with metal, and they were absorbed by the deep layers of the Earth. He could only transmit energy over short distances. The grand promises turned into failure. The funding stopped. But the worst part, as Tesla himself writes, was not the loss of money. "They stopped believing me." Euphoria was replaced by the deepest depression and despair. Rejected and ridiculed, but not broken, he knew he had to prove himself right at any cost. And then, at this darkest point in his life, he decided to take a step that he himself called insane. "And then I resolved to conduct my mad experiment," he writes. And the following words sound like a verdict. "The secret of my invention will die with me."
The failure of terrestrial energy transmission forced Tesla to seek a new path. If the Earth was absorbing his vortices, then he needed to find a reflector that would send them back. And such a reflector existed, huge, natural, and always overhead: the Moon. Tesla theorized that if he sent etheric vortex objects to the Moon, they would reflect off its electrostatic field and return to Earth, but at a considerable distance from the transmitter, obeying the simple law: the angle of incidence equals the angle of reflection. This opened up the possibility of intercontinental energy transmission. However, his first experiments in this direction led him to a new, even grander discovery. He found that the Earth itself is surrounded by a powerful electric field. And then an idea was born in his mind that took his breath away. What if he could not just reflect a signal, but create a resonance system between the Earth and the Moon? To pump the space between them with energy, like inflating a tire, and then extract it at any point. He sat down to do the calculations. The results were staggering. According to his calculations, creating such a resonance could release energy of such colossal power that it would be enough to completely wipe a large city off the face of the Earth. It was then that I first understood, he writes in his diary, that this system would be dangerous for humanity. This realization horrified him, but the desire to prove his theories, to show the world what it had turned its back on, was stronger. He decided to conduct an experiment, but in deep secrecy. First, he needed to choose a location, a point on the planet where the released energy would strike. He looked for a place with no people so as not to harm anyone. His choice fell on the Arctic. But after making calculations based on the Moon's current position, he realized that the reflected pulse would not hit the polar ice, but the vast, almost unexplored expanses of Siberia. Tesla went to the library to study everything that was known about this region. There was very little information, but from the scant data, he concluded that there were practically no people there. This reassured him. Secrecy was the main priority, as the consequences, in case of failure or public disclosure, could be catastrophic. Fortunately for his plan, by that time, most of the equipment from his laboratory had already been dismantled and taken away by creditors. But he had managed to hide and save the most essential components for the experiment. All alone, with his own hands, he assembled a new, special transmitter from these remnants and connected it to the emitter. He understood that an experiment with such an amount of energy was incredibly dangerous. One mistake in the calculations and all that power could strike back, directly at him and his laboratory. Therefore, at the designated hour, he decided to be not in the building, but at a safe distance, about 2 miles away. The operation of the device was to be controlled by a soulless and precise clockwork mechanism. The principle of the experiment, as Tesla describes it, was brilliantly simple. The generator was to emit a series of etheric vortex objects toward the Moon. Passing through the Earth's electric field, they would, like a sponge, capture charged particles. Since the Moon's field had the same polarity, the vortices would reflect off it and return to Earth, but at a different angle. Then they would reflect off the Earth's field again and head back to the Moon. This process, repeating over and over, was supposed to create a resonance, pumping the space between the two celestial bodies with energy. Upon reaching a critical concentration of charged particles, the system was supposed to self-excite, and all the accumulated energy, amplified millions of times, would transform into a single etheric vortex object of colossal, unimaginable power. But this was only a theory. He did not know what would actually happen. He remembered the day of the experiment very well. The calculated time was approaching. The minutes dragged on very slowly and felt like years, he writes. I thought I would go mad from the waiting. Finally, the clock hands reached the designated mark. Nothing. A minute passed, then 5. Nothing happened. All sorts of thoughts ran through his head. Maybe the clockwork mechanism had failed. Or was there an error in the calculations? Or maybe his whole theory was just a figment of his imagination, and nothing was supposed to happen at all. He was on the verge of madness. And then, suddenly, at some point, it seemed to him that the daylight dimmed for a moment. Simultaneously, a strange, eerie sensation passed through his entire body, as if thousands of red-hot needles had been thrust into him. It all ended as suddenly as it had begun. A distinct metallic taste remained in his mouth, and his head was ringing. He felt completely broken and exhausted. When he returned to the laboratory, he found it practically intact. The only evidence that something had happened was a strong smell of burning in the air. Madness seized him again, but this time it was despair. He never found out the result of his experiment. He believed it had failed, and only some time later, reading in the newspapers about the anomalous and catastrophic phenomena that had occurred in the remote, desolate land of Siberia, did he realize with a chilling horror what he had created. This was not just a source of energy, it was a terrible weapon, capable of causing not explosions, but entire planetary-scale catastrophes. It was what would later be called the Tunguska phenomenon. Now the main question was no longer how he did it, but why he decided to hide it from the world.
The realization of what had happened in the Siberian taiga brought Tesla neither pride nor satisfaction. It brought only a chilling horror. He had not just confirmed his theory, he had opened Pandora's box, unleashing a force capable not of creating, but of destroying on an unimaginable scale. This was not a triumph, but a curse, a burden that he would have to bear in complete solitude for the rest of his days. At that moment, the scientist-experimenter ended, and the guardian of a terrible secret was born. His entire subsequent life, all his future decisions, were dictated by this new, tragic knowledge. In the diary, he returns to a question that, he says, had always tormented him. Will my discoveries be for the good of people? Before, this question was abstract, philosophical. Now it had become terrifyingly concrete. Tesla writes with bitterness that the history of humanity is a history of appropriating and distorting great inventions. Any discovery capable of moving civilization forward was inevitably and primarily used for the more efficient extermination of one's own kind. He looked at the world around him and saw how science, to which he had dedicated his entire life, easily became a servant of destruction. And he realized that his gift, his knowledge of the ether, was the most dangerous of all. To give humanity in its current state a source of inexhaustible energy was like handing a child a loaded gun. The result would be predictable and catastrophic. After this experiment, he firmly decided that the secret of his invention would die with him. This was not the decision of a slighted genius rejected by the scientific community. It was the conscious, hard-won choice of a man who had looked into the abyss and decided not to let others follow him. He understood, of course, that sooner or later someone else might repeat his mad experiment. But for that, one key condition was necessary. One had to acknowledge the very existence of the ether. And here, as he ironically notes, history played a surprising trick on him and the entire world. It was precisely at this moment that the star of Albert Einstein was rising on the scientific Olympus. His theories, which denied the ether, captivated the minds of the planet's best physicists. The scientific world moved further and further away from the truth that Tesla considered fundamental. And what had once seemed to him a tragic mistake by his colleagues, he now saw as a salvation. In one of the most astonishing entries in his diary, Tesla writes, "I am even grateful to Einstein and others for leading humanity away from this dangerous path I was on with their erroneous theories. Perhaps this is their greatest service." What an incredible irony of fate. The man he considered his main opponent, who in his opinion was leading science to a dead end, had actually become the unwitting savior of humanity from Tesla himself. Einstein was building a new physics, and Tesla watched in silence, understanding that this new path, though wrong from his point of view, was a providential shield protecting the world from his most terrible discovery.
This was the tragedy of a genius who outran his time not only in technology, but also in his understanding of responsibility. He possessed knowledge that could change the world, but understood that the world was not ready for these changes. However, he was not an absolute pessimist. He left humanity with hope, and most importantly, time. Perhaps in 100 years, he muses in the pages of his diary, when reason prevails over animal instincts, my invention will serve people for good. He believed that one day humanity would grow up, and only then could it be entrusted with the power of the gods. It seemed that the manuscript could have ended there. The main secret revealed, the motives explained, the legacy hidden until better times. The story of energy transmission and its monstrous consequences had reached its logical conclusion. But the diary holds another, no less astonishing revelation. When Tesla, broken by his discovery, had already given up on further work in this area, his generator, the silent witness to his triumph and his horror, presented him with a completely new surprise. He noticed a strange phenomenon that had nothing to do with energy transmission, but opened a door to a field that people at the time could only read about in science fiction novels. After Tesla voluntarily took upon himself the burden of being the guardian of the most dangerous secret on the planet, it seemed that his interest in the etheric vortex generator should have faded. He no longer thought about energy transmission. That path was closed to him forever. But a brilliant mind cannot rest, and nature does not stop presenting puzzles, even when you are not looking for them. While working in his laboratory, Tesla began to notice a strange, subtle phenomenon. Every time he turned on his generator, he distinctly felt a light but constant breeze that always blew in the same direction, straight towards the operating device.
At first, he paid little attention to it, attributing it to common electrostatic effects or convection currents of air heated by the apparatus. But the phenomenon was too stable and orderly. Curiosity got the better of him. To visualize these invisible currents, he resorted to a simple but effective method. Rolling up several old newspapers, he set them on fire and immediately extinguished them, creating a source of thick white smoke. With this smoldering bundle, he began to slowly walk around the generator from all sides. The picture that appeared before his eyes was astonishing. At any point in the laboratory, no matter how far away he moved, the plume of smoke was steadily drawn towards the generator. As it approached the device, the smoke did not disperse, but rose above it in a dense column, going straight up as if into an invisible chimney. When the generator was turned off, this effect completely disappeared.
Tesla realized that this was not just electrostatics, the force was too pervasive. After considering this phenomenon in light of his ether theory, he came to a conclusion that would have seemed like absolute madness to any other scientist of his time. His generator, by acting on the ether, was somehow reducing the force of gravity in the space above it. This was a hypothesis so bold that it required immediate and irrefutable proof. To eliminate any possible electromagnetic influence that could distort the results, he built a large and precise scale, but he made it not of metal, but entirely of well-dried wood, an ideal dielectric. The design was simple. He positioned one arm of the balance beam so that it was directly above the generator and the other at a distance. In his diary, he describes this moment with poorly concealed excitement. After carefully balancing the scale to a perfect equilibrium, he turned on the generator. What happened next was like a magic trick. The side of the scale located above the apparatus, without any visible reason, shot upwards, disrupting the balance. He immediately turned off the power. The scale swung down and, after a few oscillations, came to a stop, returning to its original, perfectly balanced position. He repeated the experiment several times. The result was always the same. There was no room for doubt. This was neither static electricity nor magnetism. He had found a way to locally influence gravity. After these experiments, his mind was seized by a new, even grander idea than wireless energy. He conceived of building a flying machine. But it would not be an airplane or a dirigible. Its principle of operation was completely different, stemming directly from his understanding of the ether. He reasoned as follows: if his generator can create a region of reduced ether pressure, that is, weakened gravity, above itself, then what prevents creating such a region in any direction? A flying machine equipped with such a generator could direct its emissions in the direction of its flight. In that direction, the pressure of the ether would weaken, while from all other sides, the all-pervading ether would continue to press on the machine with its original colossal force. As a result, the craft would simply be pushed into this zone of low pressure and begin to move. The most astonishing consequence of this theory was that a person inside such a machine would feel no acceleration whatsoever. The g-forces we are familiar with arise from inertia, when a thruster, like a jet engine, pushes the body of the craft, and the craft, in turn, pushes the pilot. In Tesla's concept, there was no thruster. The ether itself, the very fabric of space, would simultaneously and uniformly push the machine, the pilot, and every atom inside. The movement would be absolute and inertialess. Such a machine could instantly change direction and achieve speeds unattainable by any other aircraft.
But where are these flying machines? Why don't we see them in the sky? The diary provides two exhaustive and tragic answers to this. Unfortunately, I had to abandon the creation of a flying machine, Tesla writes. This happened for two reasons. First, he simply had no money. After the failure of the wireless energy project, he was practically bankrupt, and the secret construction of such a revolutionary device required enormous funds. But the main, decisive reason was something else. Most importantly, he writes, a great war has begun in Europe, and I do not want my inventions to be used for killing. And again, as with the energy of the Earth, Tesla faced a moral choice. He imagined what his creation would become in the hands of the military, and he shuddered. His silent, invisible, and supermaneuverable craft would become the perfect weapon, the ultimate means of destruction. And once again, he said no. He ended this entry with a question full of despair. When will these madmen ever stop? And now, knowing all these secrets, holding in our hands the key to understanding his most private thoughts, we return from the past to our own time, where the legacy of this man is still waiting for its hour. Having read this manuscript to the end, I realized that I could never look at the world around me with the same eyes again. The new information, gleaned from these scorched pages, has forced me to look differently at phenomena that modern science either ignores or cannot explain. And the most obvious of these is the phenomenon of unidentified flying objects, the existence of which very few people doubt today. pay attention to how they move. Numerous testimonies and even video recordings show craft capable of instantly accelerating to unimaginable speeds, making sharp turns at right angles, and just as instantly coming to a dead stop. According to all the known laws of mechanics, any living creature inside such an object would be immediately crushed by the colossal G-forces. However, this does not happen, and Tesla's diary gives the only logical and frighteningly simple answer. What if these objects do not violate the laws of mechanics, but simply operate on different principles? What if they do not push against the air or expel a reactive jet to move? What if they move exactly as Tesla described the working principle of his flying machine, by creating a zone of reduced ether pressure in front of them and allowing the all-pervading force of the universe to smoothly and simultaneously move both the craft and everything inside it? With this method of movement, there are and can be no G-forces, because there is no inertia in our usual understanding. It is not the craft flying through space, it is space itself that carries it.
A logical question arises. If this manuscript has been found, if it contains such incredible knowledge, why are we not yet using these technologies? The answer is as simple as it is tragic, and it lies in the very condition of the notebook. Unfortunately, the very part of the manuscript that describes in detail the construction of the etheric vortex generator was the most severely damaged by water. Time and moisture have turned the diagrams and formulas into blurry, unreadable stains. From the surviving scraps of phrases and fragments of schematics, one can understand the general principle of its operation. One can grasp the genius's train of thought. But for the complete picture, for the recreation of a working device, key details and parameters are missing. The only way is to start all over again, to conduct new, large-scale experiments based on the priceless knowledge that Tesla has left us. But even in this damaged state, his legacy is priceless. Tesla left us not only his fears, but also his hope. He predicted that 100 years would pass before human reason could prevail over their animal instincts, and only then could his invention serve humanity for good. That time has now passed. We are living in the future he spoke of. And looking at our world, torn by conflicts, standing on the brink of environmental and energy crises, we must ask ourselves a question. Are we ready? Have we grown up enough for his gift? Will we be able to manage it wisely? Or, as he feared, will we turn it into the most perfect weapon? And who would have thought? Who could have believed that the answers to the greatest mysteries of our time, the key to clean, free energy, to interplanetary travel without G-forces, and perhaps to a completely new future for all of civilization, have been waiting all this time, not in top-secret government safes or in the depths of scientific archives. They were simply lying there, forgotten by everyone, in the form of an old, burnt notebook with the smell of mold, which served as padding in an old fire helmet bought for a pittance at a street sale in New York.